Picture this. It is 1876 in the bustling port city of Trieste. A young, desperately ambitious medical student is hunched over a laboratory table. The air in the room is thick, almost suffocating, with the sharp, acidic smell of brine and formaldehyde. Spread out before him are literally hundreds of eels, and he is painstakingly dissecting them, one by one, slicing them open in a frantic, almost obsessive search for their elusive reproductive organs. He is completely fixated, driven by a burning desire to understand the hidden, fundamental mechanics of biology. He is looking for a monumental discovery that will cement his name in the scientific pantheon. That frustrated, eel-obsessed student, his hands covered in viscera, is none other than Sigmund Freud. Welcome back to another exploration on Legendary Lives Unveiled. If you find yourself captivated by the tragic, triumphant, and profound forces that shaped history's most brilliant minds, be sure to hit that subscribe button and like this video to join our journey into the past. It is a staggering, almost comical image when you consider his ultimate trajectory. The man who would eventually claim to have mapped the hidden sexual architecture of the human mind began his career utterly baffled by the sexual anatomy of a fish. He spent hours every single day merely staring through a microscope, searching desperately for a purely physical explanation for life's deepest drives. Today, we are unpacking a giant of history, a figure whose ideas fundamentally rewired how humanity views its own consciousness. Yet, the profound irony of his life is inescapable. The man who gave us the vocabulary to understand our deepest hidden compulsions remained, until his dying day, a prisoner to his own fatal addictions. To understand the absolute revolution sparked by his ideas, we must first understand the bizarre and deeply entangled soil from which he grew. Because whether you have ever tried to decode a strange anxiety dream, called someone anal retentive, or blamed a mistake on a Freudian slip, you are speaking his language. The story truly begins in 1856 in a town called Freiburg in Moravia. From the moment of his birth, an intense, almost suffocating expectation of greatness was placed squarely upon his shoulders by his mother, Amalia. Sigmund was born with a caul, a thin fetal membrane covering his face, which Amalia immediately interpreted as a mystical omen. She literally believed her son was destined for world-changing greatness. Amalia, who was 20 years younger than her husband, Jacob Freud, a Jewish wool merchant struggling to keep the family afloat financially, fiercely favored Sigmund over her other children. She famously referred to him as her golden Siggy. When a primary caregiver views a child as a prophesied genius, it instills a formidable, unshakable self-confidence. Yet, it is a double-edged sword, simultaneously installing a crushing internal pressure to validate that prophecy. The environment where this immense pressure was applied was incredibly confusing and tangled. Jacob Freud had been married twice before, giving Sigmund two much older half-brothers, Emmanuel and Philip. Within the walls of their home, generational boundaries completely broke down. These half-brothers were roughly the exact same age as Sigmund's mother. Even more dizzying, Emmanuel already had a son named John, meaning that Sigmund's nephew was actually older than he was. John became Sigmund's earliest playmate, but also his fiercest early rival. Just imagine being a highly observant, sensitive child in a house where the normal hierarchies of parent, sibling, and peer are completely inverted. The sheer thermodynamic pressure of that multi-generational scramble forced him to become hypersensitive to hidden rivalries, complex loyalties, and unspoken jealousies. Decades later, when Freud formulated the Oedipus complex, the theory that the family unit is a cauldron of deeply submerged unconscious rivalries and desires, It was a direct reflection of his own dizzying early environment. He was not merely observing family tension, he was a test subject in a laboratory of bizarre familial dynamics. The environment forced him to become an analyst of human behavior before he even knew what the word meant. To escape the collapsing economy in Moravia, the family eventually moved to Vienna. Freud proved to be a brilliant, voracious student, mastering multiple languages and tearing through literature and history before eventually landing in the medical school at the University of Vienna. This brings us back to those eels in Trieste, and his time deeply embedded in hard, materialist science. He began working under the renowned physiologist Ernst Brücke. To truly understand Freud, you must understand Brücke's laboratory. Brücke was a strict disciple of the conservation of energy, the thermodynamic principle that energy cannot be created or destroyed, only transformed. Freud absorbed this philosophy totally. At this stage in his life, there was no unconscious mind, just chemistry. He believed that all mental processes, every passing thought and emotion, could ultimately be reduced to physical, chemical, and neurological mechanisms. He spent his time doing agonizingly precise histological work on the nervous systems of lower animals, hoping to pioneer a discovery that would prove life was merely a complex chemical equation. But mapping the nervous system of an eel does not bring global fame, and crucially, it does not pay well. Freud had fallen deeply in love with Martha Bernays, and within the rigid social structure of 19th century Vienna, he needed serious financial stability to marry her. He needed a massive medical breakthrough, a shortcut. He believed he found it in a relatively unstudied South American plant extract. This inaugurated a critical, often minimized chapter of his development that resembles a modern biohacker phase. He started researching cocaine. In the early 1880s, cocaine was not a heavily regulated street drug. It was simply an obscure alkaloid. Freud read military reports about its stimulant properties, procured a sample, and immediately started testing it on himself. He meticulously charted its effects on his mood, physical endurance, and digestion. In his view, the results were miraculous, granting him profound euphoria and boundless energy. He quickly became an evangelist for the substance, publishing glowing, enthusiastic papers that advocated for cocaine as a panacea, capable of curing everything from depression to chronic indigestion. He even sent packets of the highly addictive stimulant to his fiancée, Martha, instructing her to take it to, in his words, give her color. He was experimenting on himself and his friends entirely before the devastating addictive properties of the drug were truly understood. So eager for his breakthrough, Freud completely bypassed the rigorous, cautious methodology Brücke had taught him, acting instead on pure ambition. That ambition yielded devastating consequences when he prescribed the drug to a close friend and brilliant colleague, Ernst Fleischl-Marxow. Fleischl-Marxow was suffering from horrific chronic pain due to a surgical infection and had developed a severe morphine addiction. Genuinely believing he had found a miracle cure, Freud treated his friend with heavy doses of cocaine. The physiological mechanism of cocaine on dopamine receptors was completely unknown to them. Rather than curing the addiction, Freud merely superimposed a crippling cocaine dependency directly over the existing morphine dependency. The result was catastrophic. Fleischl-Marxow descended into severe cocaine psychosis, hallucinating snakes crawling under his skin, and suffered a prolonged, agonizing decline before his premature death. This was a shattering blow to Freud's professional confidence. He had essentially catalyzed the destruction of his own friend. The already conservative Viennese medical establishment began to view him with intense suspicion, dismissing him as reckless. The hard chemical approach had completely blown up in his face, and Freud desperately needed a completely new direction. Around this time, A medical mystery was paralyzing the hospitals of Europe, a condition that defied every established rule of Brücke's physical laboratory. Patients were presenting with staggering physical ailments: sudden blindness, complete paralysis of a limb, severe localized pain, and even an absolute inability to speak their native language. Yet, neurologically and physically, their nerves and organs were perfectly healthy. The prevailing medical wisdom in Vienna brutally dismissed these patients, who were predominantly women, as malingerers, fakers, or victims of a vague, untreatable degeneration of the brain. The catch-all diagnosis was hysteria. Seeking answers, Freud secured a travel grant in 1885 and left Vienna to study in Paris at the Salpêtrière Hospital under Jean-Martin Charcot, the undisputed rock star of 19th century neurology. Charcot did not treat these patients as fakers. He treated them as a profound neurological puzzle. Using highly theatrical methods, Charcot would hold massive clinical demonstrations in lecture halls, presenting hysterical patients to vast audiences of doctors and intellectuals. Much like a showman, Charcot used hypnosis to demonstrate something revolutionary. He could artificially induce hysterical paralysis in a susceptible patient, and then, while they were still in the trance, turn it off and remove it completely. He proved irrefutably that the mechanism of hysteria was psychological, not physical. The mind was capable of completely overriding the body's hardware. This single demonstration shattered Freud's strict materialist worldview, proving the existence of a layer of the mind that operated with immense power, entirely bypassing conscious will. Returning to Vienna forever changed, Freud established his private practice and teamed up with an older, highly respected physician named Joseph Breuer. It was Breuer who handed Freud the key to the entire psychoanalytic kingdom. He told Freud of a patient he had treated years prior, a brilliant young woman immortalized in medical case studies as Anna O., whose real name was Bertha Pappenheim. When her beloved father had fallen terminally ill and she took on the role of his primary nurse, Bertha developed a cascade of severe hysterical symptoms. She suffered from a nervous cough, paralysis on the right side of her body, visual disturbances, and most bizarrely, acute hydrophobia, a terrifying fear of water. Despite suffering from intense, agonizing thirst, she was physically incapable of drinking a glass of water. She would also spontaneously lose the ability to speak German, communicating only in English or French. Breuer was completely baffled by the physical symptoms, but noticed a striking pattern. When Bertha fell into states of self-induced hypnosis, which she called her clouds, she would mutter fragmented emotional phrases. When Breuer repeated these phrases back to her, Bertha would begin to narrate complex fantasies or deeply buried memories. Here, the thermodynamic mechanism Freud had learned from Brücke clicked into a new psychological place. If Bertha could trace a specific physical symptom back to the exact moment of a forgotten trauma, the symptom would simply vanish. Bertha brilliantly coined her own term for this process: the talking cure, or chimney sweeping. The mechanism relied on the conservation of energy. When a person experiences profound trauma, the emotional energy, the affect, must be discharged. If social constraints or sheer horror prevent that emotional release, the energy does not disappear. It becomes trapped. Freud called this trapped energy cathexis. This trapped psychological energy converts itself into physical energy, manifesting as a hysterical symptom. The physical symptom is essentially a physical monument to an unexpressed emotion. Look closely at her inability to drink water, because the example is endlessly fascinating. Under hypnosis, she recalled an incident she had completely repressed. She had walked into a room and seen her English governess's dog drinking out of a glass on the table. Bertha found this utterly repulsive. However, bound by the rigid, stifling rules of Victorian politeness, she swallowed the emotion down, refusing to scream or express her disgust. The thermodynamic energy of that disgust was trapped, and its physical manifestation was an inability to let water pass her lips. The very moment Brewer helped her remember the event, and she finally expressed the intense anger and revulsion she had been holding on to, she immediately asked for a glass of water and drank it effortlessly. The psychic energy had been discharged, a process they called catharsis. And without an energy source, the symptom evaporated. This breakthrough led Brewer and Freud to co-author studies on hysteria in 1895, famously declaring that hysterics suffer mainly from reminiscences. It seemed like a total medical triumph, discovering both the mechanism and the cure. However, this seemingly perfect collaboration ended in a sudden, explosive rupture. The break occurred because of a terrifying side effect of the treatment itself. Unearthing deeply buried trauma creates an incredibly intense, volatile emotional bond between the doctor and the patient. As treatment progressed, Bertha developed a profound, almost consuming attachment to Brewer. The absolute breaking point arrived one evening when Brewer was urgently summoned to her house. He walked into the room to find Bertha in the throes of a hysterical phantom pregnancy, a condition known as pseudopsoriasis. She was experiencing severe abdominal cramps and loudly declared to everyone in the room that she was giving birth to Dr. Brewer's child. Her unconscious mind had generated the physical reality of labor based entirely on the intense psychological magnitude of her attachment to her doctor. This astonishing display of the mind-body connection would soon lead Freud to codify an explosive new mechanism, forcing him directly into a controversial storm that would horrify the medical establishment and rewrite the rules of human psychology forever. But while a scandalized Brewer fled the house in sheer terror, Freud prepared to lean directly into the tempest. Brewer wanted absolutely nothing to do with the dangerous, highly sexualized forces they had accidentally unearthed, fleeing the house in a scandalized panic. But Freud did the exact opposite. He leaned directly into the storm. He realized that this sexual energy, this transference, where a patient unconsciously redirects immense unresolved feelings and sexual desires from past relationships onto the figure of the analyst, wasn't an unfortunate side effect. It was the raw fuel of the human psyche. This realization pulled him into a massive pivot, one of the most fiercely debated controversies in the history of psychology, the seduction theory. In his early clinical work in the mid-1890s, listening to patient after patient uncover repressed memories, Freud noticed a horrifyingly consistent pattern. Beneath the hysterical symptoms, his patients, predominantly middle-class Viennese women, were recalling memories of literal, actual childhood sexual abuse, often perpetrated by fathers, uncles, or governesses. In 1896, Freud boldly presented his seduction theory to the medical society, arguing that the root cause of all hysteria was actual sexual trauma experienced in early childhood. The reaction from his colleagues was freezing cold, dismissing him as suggesting a scientific fairy tale. To accept his theory meant accepting that the respectable bourgeois households of Vienna were rife with child abuse, a horrific reality they resolutely refused to acknowledge. Then, a few years later, Freud completely retracted the theory. He wrote to his close friend Wilhelm Fliess, stating, "I no longer believe in my neurotica." He pivoted, claiming that these were not memories of real abuse, but rather unconscious fantasies of childhood desire. This moment marks the birth of the Oedipus complex, the idea that children have innate, unconscious sexual desires for their parents. The interpretation of why Freud made this immense shift remains deeply fractured today. The orthodox psychoanalytic perspective views this as Freud's greatest intellectual leap. They argue that he realized the unconscious mind cannot distinguish between a deeply ingrained fantasy and a literal event, meaning the fantasy acts exactly like a trauma. According to this view, abandoning the search for a literal abuser allowed Freud to discover the internal mythic drama of the human psyche, the innate drives and conflicts that shape all human development. However, modern researchers, delving into the uncensored archives, present a much darker narrative. They argue Freud did not make a brilliant scientific leap, but rather a cowardly, calculated retreat. The clinical notes pointed to real trauma, meaning Freud knew the abuse was real, but the societal and professional pressure was simply too immense. By accusing the patriarchs of Vienna of widespread abuse, he was committing professional suicide and alienating the establishment he desperately wanted to join. Under the threat of ostracization, he suppressed the truth, buckled, and essentially blamed the victims by relabeling their horrific memories as their own hidden sexual fantasies. Yet, because the concept of the unconscious fantasy was theoretically elegant and offered a comprehensive map of human development, it became the foundational dogma of the new science. It was simply too useful to throw away. Whether born of cowardice or a genuine theoretical breakthrough, this pivot irrevocably changed psychology. By shifting the focus from external trauma to internal fantasy, Freud no longer needed to interrogate the past like a detective. He needed a method to map the internal landscape. Finding hypnosis unreliable and too dependent on the physician's suggestion, he abandoned it for a completely new technique: free association. This created the iconic image of psychoanalysis. The patient lies down on a couch, facing away from the analyst to remove the pressure of being watched. The rule was deceptively simple: say absolutely everything that crosses your mind. The patient was instructed not to filter or censor anything, no matter how trivial, embarrassing, or nonsensical the thought seemed. The theory was brilliantly simple. If you remove social constraints and let the mind wander, the conscious defense mechanisms naturally lower, and the hidden, repressed truth of the unconscious invariably bubbles to the surface. It leaks out through hesitations, seemingly random shifts in topic, and slips of the tongue. But free association was agonizingly slow. Freud needed a more direct route, a cipher to decode the unconscious. He found it in a phenomenon we all experience every night: dreams. Freud famously called dreams the royal road to the unconscious. In 1899, he published what he considered his absolute masterpiece, The Interpretation of Dreams. This legendary text fundamentally reshaped 20th century literature, art, and psychology. Yet initially, it was a commercial disaster. It took 8 excruciating years to sell the first print run of just 600 copies. The medical establishment mocked and ignored it, finding the premise absurd. The prevailing scientific view at the time was that dreams were merely somatic noise, the brain firing randomly as the body rested, trying to make sense of indigestion or a cold draft. Freud completely inverted this, arguing that dreams are highly complex, deeply meaningful structures, specifically functioning as wish fulfillments. Because these wishes are driven by primitive, unacceptable sexual and aggressive instincts, the conscious mind would be too horrified to experience them directly, even in sleep. Therefore, the mind has to employ a profound disguise. Freud was very specific about the architecture of this disguise, dividing the dream into 2 distinct layers. The first is the manifest content, which is the literal narrative you remember when you wake up. The bizarre sequence of events like walking down a hallway, a clock melting, or a person who looks like your boss but speaks with your mother's voice. The manifest content acts as the mask. Beneath that lies the latent content, the raw, repressed desire or anxiety that the dream is actually attempting to process. The process of translating the unacceptable latent wish into the bizarre manifest imagery is what Freud called the dream work. This dream work relies on mechanisms like condensation, where three different people are mashed into one dream character, or displacement, where the intense anger you feel toward your spouse is redirected onto a harmless object. In the dream, like a broken teacup, the analyst's job is to reverse engineer this dream work to find the latent truth. This constant, grueling battle between hidden desires and conscious censorship led Freud to build his ultimate structural model of the human mind, the tripartite soul. Freud realized the mind is not a unified entity, but rather a battlefield of competing agendas. At the absolute foundation, operating entirely in the dark unconscious, is the id. Think of the id not just as a primal urge, but as the incredibly corrupt, ruthless CEO of a massive corporation. It operates strictly on the pleasure principle, possessing all the company's capital, the raw biological energy of sex, aggression, and survival. It has absolutely zero concept of morality, logic, or time. If this CEO wants to liquidate assets for immediate gratification, it demands it instantly. The id does not negotiate. Existing in direct hostile opposition to the id is the superego. Developing later and deeply internalized from parents, culture, and religious structures, the superego operates on the morality principle. Continuing the analogy, the superego is a coalition of terrifyingly strict government regulators and hypercritical internal auditors who demand absolute perfection. They don't just police behavior, they police thoughts. If the corrupt CEO of the id even thinks about doing something unethical, the superego threatens to shut down the entire corporation with overwhelming feelings of guilt, shame, and anxiety. This creates an impossible, paralyzing standoff. If the id has its way, the individual is destroyed by society. If the superego wins, the individual is paralyzed by guilt and rigid inhibition. To survive this structural conflict, the mind requires a mediator. Enter the ego. The ego is the exhausted, desperately overworked PR executive of the corporation, operating on the reality principle. It is the only part of the mind that actually has to interact with the outside world. The ego's job is a nightmare of continuous negotiation. It must find a way to bleed off the thermodynamic pressure of the id's demands, while simultaneously spinning those actions to appease the draconian audits of the superego, all while navigating the actual physical constraints of reality. So, when you use a defense mechanism like rationalizing a terrible financial decision or projecting your own anger onto a coworker, that is simply your ego desperately drafting a press release to keep the corporation from imploding. When laid out like this, Freud's ultimate conclusion is utterly terrifying. He is telling us that the PR executive, the conscious I, that we think is in charge, making rational decisions, is barely holding the wheel. We are largely strangers to ourselves, buffeted by massive competing forces operating entirely in the dark. It was a monumental blow to human narcissism. We were no longer the rational masters of the Enlightenment. We were merely rationalizing animals. As these explosive ideas began to permeate the intellectual circles of Vienna, Freud started attracting a dedicated group of followers who met in his waiting room. But Freud was incredibly strategic. He looked around the room and realized his movement had a dangerous demographic problem. Psychoanalysis was heavily associated with Jewish intellectuals in Vienna, and Freud faced intense systemic anti-Semitism from the broader European medical establishment. He knew that if psychoanalysis remained localized, it would be dismissed as a niche, sectarian movement. He desperately needed an ambassador, a brilliant Gentile ambassador, and he found the perfect candidate in a charismatic rising star from Switzerland, a man whose arrival would trigger the most intellectually explosive relationship of the 20th century. The collision between Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung is one of the most intellectually explosive relationships of the 20th century. Jung was the son of a Swiss Reformed pastor, working at the prestigious Burghölzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich. When they finally met in Vienna in 1907, the intellectual chemistry was staggering. They sat down and conversed without a single break for 13 straight hours of unbroken psychoanalytic debate. It was an absolute intellectual bromance. Freud was completely captivated, explicitly using the biblical metaphor of Joshua, the man who would lead the Israelites into the Promised Land, to describe his new protege. He saw Jung as the heir apparent, his crown prince. Initially, Jung returned that veneration, looking to Freud as a powerful, validating father figure. They even traveled together to America in 1909 to lecture at Clark University, which was the exact moment psychoanalysis finally broke onto the global stage. But despite the outward unity, massive tectonic fault lines were developing beneath the surface of their theoretical frameworks. The core dispute centered on the concept of libido. For Freud, libido was strictly and fundamentally sexual energy. Every drive, every neurosis, and every cultural achievement was ultimately a sublimation of sexual tension. Jung could not accept that reductionism. Jung viewed the libido as elan vital, a general creative life energy that could manifest as sex, but also as spirituality, art, and the drive for deep meaning. This profound philosophical difference bled into their personal interests. Freud was a hardened, materialist atheist who viewed all religion as a collective delusion and a mass neurosis. Jung, deeply influenced by his religious background, was fascinated by mythology, alchemy, Eastern religions, and the occult. Jung began to formulate his own structural model of the mind, theorizing a deeper layer beneath Freud's personal unconscious, the collective unconscious. He argued that we all inherit a shared psychological substrate filled with universal archetypes and mythic symbols from our evolutionary ancestors. Freud saw this as a terrifying betrayal. To Freud, the strict sexual theory was the scientific anchor of psychoanalysis. He wrote to Jung, pleading with him to hold the line on the sexual theory, calling it an essential bulwark against what he termed the black tide of mud of occultism and mysticism. He believed Jung was dragging his hard-won science back into the dark ages of superstition. The tension reached a breaking point during an encounter in Freud's study in Vienna in 1909. They were fiercely debating parapsychology. Jung was defending the validity of psychic phenomena, and Freud was dismissively shutting him down from a position of strict materialist logic. And then the room itself seemed to intervene. As Freud was lecturing him, Jung suddenly felt an intense burning sensation in his diaphragm. At that exact microsecond, a massive, explosive crack erupted from the wooden bookcase next to them, so loud it startled them both. Jung, deeply attuned to synchronicity, immediately leveraged the moment, telling Freud that it was an example of a catalytic exteriorization phenomenon. He argued that the intense psychic energy of their argument physically manifested in the wood. Freud, furious, scoffed and said, "Bosh, that is sheer nonsense." But Jung stood his ground, looked Freud directly in the eye, and predicted that to prove his point, there would be another such loud report in a moment. Incredibly, a few seconds later, a second massive crack echoed from the bookcase. The psychological impact of that moment on Freud was profound. The fiercely rational scientist was visibly shaken by an event he could not empirically explain. He began to view Jung not merely as an erring student, but as a dangerous, chaotic force threatening the very foundation of his life's work. The relationship rapidly deteriorated, and the father-son dynamic inverted into a bitter, toxic rivalry. Because they were both master psychoanalysts, their breakup letters were uniquely brutal. They did not just argue theory. They weaponized the theory against each other's psyches. Instead of debating the merits of the collective unconscious, Freud essentially diagnosed Jung as suffering from a severe neurotic complex, incapable of accepting the sexual realities of the libido due to unresolved patricidal urges. Jung fired back, diagnosing Freud as rigidly dogmatic, trapped in his own neuroses, and treating his theories like an infallible religious dogma. By 1913, the break was absolute, and they severed all personal and professional ties. Freud was cleaning house. He excommunicated Alfred Adler as well, another brilliant early disciple who dared to suggest that the fundamental human drive wasn't sex, but the pursuit of social power, the inferiority complex. Freud then orchestrated the formation of a secret committee of loyal analysts who literally pledged to defend his original theories against any deviation, effectively creating a dogmatic echo chamber that isolated psychoanalysis from broader scientific research for decades. But just as Freud finished constructing the fortress walls around his theory, the outside world exploded. In 1914, World War I began, and the mechanization of slaughter shattered Europe. The war created a massive theoretical crisis for Freud's fortress. Hospitals were overflowing with soldiers suffering from shell shock, presenting symptoms that completely broke Freud's foundational mechanism. Since the beginning, Freud had argued that all human behavior was governed by the pleasure principle. The id seeks pleasure and avoids pain. Even nightmares were theorized as deeply disguised wish fulfillments, but the traumatized soldiers of the trenches were waking up screaming every night, reliving the exact moments of artillery barrages, gas attacks, and the gruesome deaths of their comrades. There was zero pleasure to be found in those dreams. There was no hidden wish being fulfilled. The mind was simply forcing the individual to experience the absolute worst trauma over and over again. To explain this shattering of the pleasure principle, Freud proposed a new mechanism, the repetition compulsion, arguing that the mind, when overwhelmed by an unmasterable trauma, attempts to retroactively master the stimuli by repeating it. This theoretical crisis was deeply entangled with his own agonizing personal reality. As the war ended, the devastation continued when the Spanish flu pandemic swept across the globe, reaching Freud's family in 1920. His beloved daughter Sophie, whom he affectionately called his Sunday child, was vibrant, married, and pregnant with her third child. She contracted influenza, which rapidly degenerated into severe pneumonia. Compounding the tragedy was the post-war infrastructure collapse. The trains across Europe were largely shut down. Freud and his wife Martha were trapped in Vienna, completely powerless and unable to reach Sophie in Hamburg. She died on January 25, 1920, at the age of 26. Freud could not even attend her funeral, writing a deeply stoic but devastated letter. "Tomorrow, she will be cremated, our poor Sunday child." The relentless grief did not stop. 3 years later, Sophie's youngest son, Heinrich, a child Freud absolutely adored and felt a deep intellectual kinship with, died of miliary tuberculosis. Freud, who had weathered decades of professional rejection with iron resolve, later confessed that the loss of this child fundamentally broke something inside him, writing that he found no joy in life after that, synthesizing the sheer scale of the industrialized slaughter of World War I with the agonizing, arbitrary cruelty of losing his daughter and grandson. Freud's philosophy underwent a profound darkening. The pleasure principle was no longer sufficient to explain the human condition. In his seminal 1920 work, Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he introduced a terrifying new dualism to the human psyche. He argued that the life drives, eros, the instincts for survival, sex, and creative connection, are locked in a perpetual, unwinnable war against a newly identified force, thanatos, the death drive. Freud hypothesized that because life evolved from inorganic matter, every living organism harbors a fundamental biological urge to return to that state of inorganic stillness, a state of absolute zero tension. We basically harbor a drive to stop existing. Thanatos is the drive towards self-destruction, aggression, and oblivion. Human history, therefore, isn't a march of steady progress. It is the visible battlefield of eros binding things together and thanatos tearing them apart. It was a remarkably bleak perspective, but the horrors of the early 20th century forced Freud to acknowledge that humanity possesses an innate capacity, perhaps even a desire, for self-annihilation. The most tragic, fascinating paradox of Freud's life is that as he was brilliantly articulating the mechanics of the unconscious drive toward self-destruction, he was physically acting it out on his own body. The architect of the ego, the man who mapped the defense mechanisms of denial, rationalization, and compulsion, was hopelessly, fatally addicted to cigars. He smoked an average of 20 cigars a day and had been chain smoking since his mid-20s, considering it absolutely vital to his intellectual output. Years earlier, his physician friend Wilhelm Fliess had explicitly warned him that his severe heart palpitations were a direct result of nicotine toxicity, but Freud outright refused to stop. He used his immense intellect to rationalize the addiction, writing to Fliess that he considered a shortened life an acceptable trade-off for the capacity to work and theorize. It was the ego drafting a brilliant press release to justify the ID's destructive demand. But the reality principle always catches up. In 1923, the same year he finalized his structural model of the mind, Freud noticed a painful, localized growth on the roof of his mouth and his right palate. He showed the lesion to his physician, Felix Deutsch. Deutsch, examining a 67-year-old heavy smoker, grieving the devastating loss of his family, was terrified that a cancer diagnosis would trigger a catastrophic, suicidal depression. Invoking a deeply paternalistic medical ethic, Deutsch lied, telling Freud the growth was merely leukoplakia, a benign irritation. But Freud, whose entire life was dedicated to seeing through deception, suspected the truth immediately. With characteristic dark, acerbic wit, he began referring to the growth as, "my dear neoplasm." He sought treatment from Dr. Marcus Hayek, but the first surgery was an absolute butchery in an outpatient clinic. Hayek failed to properly manage the bleeding, and Freud hemorrhaged severely. If not for the quick, desperate intervention of his intellectually disabled wardmates who ran for help, Freud very likely would have bled to death that day. The pathology report confirmed his horrific suspicion: squamous cell carcinoma, oral cancer. That botched surgery inaugurated a grueling 16-year war of attrition against his own flesh. Between 1923 and his death in 1939, Freud endured 33 surgeries. The cancer aggressively infiltrated his upper jaw, forcing surgeons to remove his entire right upper jaw and parts of his soft palate, permanently destroying the partition between his mouth and his nasal cavity. To allow him to speak and eat, he was fitted with a massive, unwieldy prosthetic device that filled the entire void in his skull, which Freud simply referred to as the monster. It was agonizing to insert, altered his voice into a thick nasal timbre, and caused continuous sores and severe chronic infections. Yet, His stoicism was legendary. He famously refused strong analgesics for most of his illness because he demanded his cognitive faculties remain absolutely sharp. In agony, he maintained his clinical practice and wrote sweeping, monumental cultural critiques like Civilization and Its Discontents, exploring the inevitable conflict between human instinct and societal restriction while battling necrotic tissue and gangrene. It is the ultimate tragic validation of his own theories. Freud, the rational ego, knew the cigars were the direct mechanism of his agony. Freud, the Stoic, endured the consequences. But the primal compulsion, the raw force of his own internal thanatos, overpowered the reality principle. The death drive won out. He expertly utilized his mastery of psychological defense mechanisms to rationalize his own fatal flaw. But while Freud was locked in this grueling internal battle with his own mutinous cells, a far more terrifying, mechanized monster was preparing to consume all of Europe. While Freud was locked in this grueling internal battle with his own mutinous cells, a far more terrifying external monster was consuming Europe. The 1930s arrive. The Nazi Party ascends to power in Germany. They view psychoanalysis not as a science, but as a degenerate, corrupting Jewish ideology. When the Nazis orchestrated the mass book burnings across Germany in 1933, Freud's life's work was thrown into the pyres. The crowds chanted a specific fire oath, condemning his works for the soul-shredding overvaluation of sexual activity. Freud's reaction from Vienna, even as the flames consumed his legacy, was coated in his trademark irony. He reportedly observed, "What progress we are making. In the Middle Ages, they would have burned me. Now they are content with burning my books." He maintained a stubborn, almost delusional belief that the cultural institutions of Austria would hold against the fascist tide. But then comes March 1938, the Anschluss. Nazi Germany annexes Austria without a shot fired, and swastikas drape the streets of Vienna. The systematic terror begins immediately. The Gestapo raids Freud's iconic apartment at Berggasse 19, confiscating money and harassing his family. Yet Freud, old, frail, and deeply attached to the city where he built his empire, still resists fleeing. The mechanism of denial is powerful even in its discoverer. It wasn't until the Gestapo arrested his daughter, Anna Freud, who had become a brilliant psychoanalyst in her own right, and held her for hours of intense interrogation, that the reality of their lethal peril shattered his resistance. Anna was released, but Freud knew they had to escape immediately. A massive, frantic, international diplomatic effort was mobilized by influential friends and colleagues, notably Princess Marie Bonaparte and Ernest Jones, to secure the exorbitant exit visas required to leave the Reich. To finally secure their departure, the Nazis forced the 82-year-old, cancer-ridden Freud to sign a propaganda document, asserting that he had been treated with respect by the authorities and had no complaints. He signed it. The legend goes that he added a final, sarcastic sentence: "I can heartily recommend the Gestapo to anyone." It is a brilliant legend, but historically, the archives suggest he didn't actually write that on the official document. It would have been too dangerously provocative. However, what is historically documented is a similarly cutting remark he made to a friend after the Nazi authorities effectively looted his bank accounts to pay a flight tax. He quipped, "I never received as much for a house call." His intellect remained a weapon until the end. They board the Orient Express and manage the harrowing journey to London. But the reprieve is brief. The cancer is advancing with terrifying speed. By 1939, Freud is confined to his study in London. The tumor has aggressively eaten through his cheek, creating an inoperable open wound. The The smell of the necrotic bone and tissue is so overwhelming that his beloved chow dog, Loon, cowers in the far corner of the room, physically unable to approach his master. It is an agonizing, deeply poignant image. One of the greatest minds of the century, trapped in a rapidly failing, isolating body. But Freud retained absolute agency over the final mechanism of his life. A decade earlier, he had forged a solemn pact with his trusted personal physician, Max Schur. Freud explicitly made Schur promise that when the suffering became entirely pointless and stripped of dignity, Schur would not hesitate to help him end it. On September 21st, 1939, Freud calls Schur to his bedside. He takes the doctor's hand and says, "My dear Schur, you certainly remember our first talk. You promised me then not to forsake me when my time comes. Now it is nothing but torture. It makes no sense anymore." Schur honored the pact. After securing the heartbroken consent of Anna Freud, who had devoted her life to his care, Schur administered a fatal dose of morphine. 12 hours later, he administered a second dose. On September 23, 1939, a date that coincidentally fell on Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement, Sigmund Freud slipped into a final coma and died. He authored his own exit, escaping the tyranny of fascism and the tyranny of his own failing biology on his precise terms. It is a staggering conclusion to a century-defining life. But Freud's death was not the end of the narrative. In many ways, it was the opening of a new battlefield. Because the moment he was gone, the critiques of his work, which had been building for decades, erupted. The scientific backlash was rooted deeply in the philosophy of science, most famously articulated by Sir Karl Popper. Popper established the criterion of falsifiability. For a theory to be considered robustly scientific, it must be constructed in a way that allows it to be proven false through empirical testing. Popper looked at psychoanalysis and declared it an unfalsifiable pseudoscience. The extreme flexibility of the interpretive mechanism makes it practically meaningless in a strict empirical laboratory. Alongside the methodological critique came a devastating feminist backlash. Thinkers like Karen Horney, herself a trained psychoanalyst, systematically dismantled Freud's intense patriarchal bias. She attacked his concept of penis envy, arguing that Freud had completely failed to comprehend the actual lived experience of women. He took the specific neuroses of repressed 19th century bourgeois men and mistakenly elevated them to universal human truths. Horney argued brilliantly that women weren't envious of male biology. They were envious of the sheer systemic power, autonomy, and privilege that society granted to that biology. Freud conflated a social inequality with a biological destiny. Today, in modern psychiatry, you rarely see a patient lying on a couch, free associating 4 days a week. We utilize highly structured, measurable frameworks, like cognitive behavioral therapy, to rewire conscious thought patterns. And we rely on advanced psychopharmacology to balance neurochemistry. So does that mean Freud's map of the mind is entirely obsolete? That is the pivotal question of his legacy. The answer coming from the frontiers of modern science is surprising. Psychoanalysis in its classical form may be diminished, but the underlying mechanisms Freud proposed are finding profound validation in a new field called neuropsychoanalysis, pioneered by researchers like Mark Solms using functional MRI technology. They are mapping the neural correlates of Freud's abstract concepts. Solms points to the deep ancient structures of the brainstem and the limbic system, the areas responsible for our core homeostatic drives: survival, lust, rage, and panic. These primal affective systems operate constantly, entirely below our conscious awareness, relentlessly demanding satisfaction. That is the neurological equivalent of the ED. The prefrontal cortex, the evolutionary newcomer, responsible for executive function, impulse control, and navigating social reality, acts exactly like the ego and the superego, frantically trying to inhibit and channel the demands of the brainstem. Modern neuroscience is fundamentally confirming Freud's most terrifying and revolutionary premise: that consciousness, the rational decision-making, is just a thin, fragile layer resting on top of a massive, ancient, and largely uncontrollable biological engine. The specific Victorian mechanisms he proposed, the Oedipus complex, the intricate decodings of dream imagery, the psychosexual stages, may be viewed today as cultural artifacts rather than hard science. But his architectural blueprint of the human condition remains unshakable. He permanently shattered the arrogant illusion of the Enlightenment that humans are purely rational actors. He taught us that we are deeply conflicted, fragmented beings, constantly managing the invisible weight of our pasts and the terrifying power of our hidden drives. He dared to dive into the absolute darkest, most chaotic depths of the human experience and attempted to draw a map. And even if he mislabeled some of the continents, he proved that the vast, uncharted ocean of the unconscious actually exists. The next time you find yourself making a completely irrational choice, or you snap at someone you love over something trivial, or you forget a word you know perfectly well, stop and ask yourself, who is really driving the car? Are you the master of your own mind, making logical, independent choices? Or is your conscious self just the exhausted PR department, frantically spinning a narrative to cover up the actions of an unconscious entity you barely control? If this journey into the hidden architecture of the human mind challenged how you view yourself, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like this audio, and share it with someone who loves a good psychological mystery. We dissect the triumphs, the tragedies, and the brilliant flaws of history's most fascinating figures, right here on Legendary Lives Unveiled. Drop a comment below based on the evidence. What is your final verdict on Sigmund Freud? A scientific pioneer? A dogmatic mythmaker? Or something entirely unique? Keep questioning the narratives you are told, and keep exploring what lies beneath the surface.